the 7th day of June, 1753, British ships sailed into what is now Lunenburg Harbor. Their cargo, an eager group of men, women, and children from mainland Europe, intent on building new lives in Nova Scotia. Of the 2,700 who had left their homes along the Rhine, only 1,453 had made it this far. What drove those who had arrived? How, after 3 years of waiting, could these so-called foreign Protestants remain set on coming here? To answer that question, we have to look to their homelands in Germany, Switzerland, and France at this time. The Rhineland, 1749. Germanic peoples had populated this area for countless centuries, under various names and faiths. But by the mid-18th century, the now Protestant Germans were beginning to feel the effects of overpopulation. Constrained to lives of serfdom under feudal lords who had ruled for centuries, some of them had begun to succumb to starvation. Thus, for many of these families, the offer of a new start in a fertile land, not afflicted by the squabbles of feudal lords and kings, must have seemed too good to be true. But, in truth, the British needed the Germans, at least as badly as the Germans wanted to leave the Brits. Nova Scotia had only recently entered British hands, through a treaty with France in 1713. Most of the population were still French-speaking Acadian Catholics, who lived in collaboration with the Mi'kmaq, and called the area around Lunenburg Mirligesh. The British government, deeming the Acadians too disloyal to the Crown, first attempted to settle Englishmen from the lower classes of London in the area, but allegedly found that they had too much of a habit for drinking and not enough of one for actually working. In 1749, the year Halifax itself was founded, Edward Cornwallis, British governor of Nova Scotia, asked for more suitable settlers. The task of finding them fell to a man named John Dick. The initial offer was of 50 acres of land for each adult man, with 10 acres added for each woman and child, as well as a year of free subsistence, along with tools and building materials, and this seemed to satisfy the new settlers. But not all these promises would be fulfilled, and Dick's efforts weren't without opposition. The idea of settling foreign Protestants in British colonies wasn't new or exclusive to Nova Scotia. For decades prior to John Dick's scheme, various colonial leaders and English merchants had been recruiting German, Dutch, Swiss, and other farmers for colonies such as Pennsylvania and Carolina. Their agents would attempt to convince the would-be settlers of Nova Scotia's supposed barrenness and hostility, telling them instead to agree to come to their own colonies further south. Nevertheless, in 1750, John Dick was able to send off the first shipload of immigrants aboard the Anne. 2 years later, though he'd made a net loss for himself, the English merchant had sent off a number more ships, and by 1753, a good and final 9 ships had arrived in Halifax Harbor, giving the colony good enough size to start. In the meantime, however, the passengers who'd been at dock for over a year were becoming restless. Made to work on government projects to pay for their crossing, their plight may have been better than those of colonists in other colonies, who were indentured laborers for the higher classes of the area. Still, the British authorities had not kept all their promises when it came to supplies and food, let alone the ability to establish themselves on their own land. While some remained determined to wait for settlement, others moved to Halifax, further attritioning the colonization party, which had already taken casualties in the crossing. Still, on the 8th of June, the remaining settlers were disembarked on the site that was to become Lunenburg. But to their disappointment, the greater part of the promised supplies still didn't come. As winter rolled around, the majority of the population were still living in small shacks, with measly supplies of firewood, ever forced to work on the palisade around the settlement rather than improve their lands. Rumors spread that the Brits had a large stockpile of supplies, which they were withholding from the settlers and consuming themselves. As December set in, a revolt began to brew, which would later become known as the Hoffman Insurrection. John Hoffman is believed to have arrived in Halifax aboard the Alderney in 1750, and held importance in Halifax before being dismissed due to not fulfilling the requirement of 7 years residency, and also in part due to a negative sentiment towards Germans. Shortly thereafter, he wound up in Lunenburg with the rest. Building on the frustrations of the settlers, he led a mob armed with crude weapons and tools to take a blockhouse set up by the British. Shortly thereafter, with little real combat, the insurrection was quelled when the English commander, Captain Patrick Sutherland, called for help from Halifax. 2 ships bearing a number of regular troops arrived shortly thereafter, taking Hoffman to Halifax, where he was fined and locked up for 2 years. This assured that no future rebellions were likely, but at the same time alerted the Brits to the severity of the situation of the settlers. The families that had managed to survive and thrive in these early years carried on, in somewhat anglicized forms, many of the names common to the area to this day: Zwicker, Muller, Meisner, Wynot, and many others. And so, the foreign Protestants went on to build and embody Lunenburg and the area. No matter where we trace our roots, we have to admire their tenacity in the face of long-waiting injustice and adversity. The graves of some of these proud people from another era can still be found, dotting the older cemeteries of the country, as memorials to their legacy of adaptation and hard work. Their names, just like the impact on Nova Scotia and the world, can remain forever.